Hello and welcome to another Photoshop tutorial. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be walking you through creating false 3D text with the added bonus of going over layers, layer styles, clipping, and layer masks. And just remember, by all means, this is not the definitive way to accomplish this, but rather a way to show how some of the tools can be used. We're going to go ahead and create a new document by going to File, then New, and I'm going to input my dimensions of 1920 by 1080 with a resolution of 300. Hit OK and we're ready to get started. I want to fill this space with white. An easy way to do that is to reset my colors, then hit Ctrl Backspace to fill it in with my background color. Alternatively, I can use Alt Backspace to use my foreground color. Next, I'm going to bring up my Type tool with T, click anywhere, then write in the word duck, or the cuck. There we go. We need to space these letters out a bit for adding the actual 3D to them. I'll open up the font menu and go to tracking. A higher number will spread the letters out while a negative one will squish them together. You can see as I'm adjusting the numbers, it's moving it out from the left edge, but I want it to go out from the center. To change that, I'll switch to my paragraph panel. Then click on the second icon here, which will simply center the text, and it also has the side effect of bumping the text into a position I don't want. Fortunately, I can select my Move tool with V, then press Ctrl A on my keyboard to select the entire document. Up here in the Tool Action bar, you'll now see some of these buttons have lit up, and we're going to want the ones with the line through the center of the blocks. This basically means it's going to align it to those points and along the entire document. You can also use it to align two layers by selecting them both in the Layers panel. Just want to bump it up a smidge, because we're going to be adding a little bit of shadow underneath later. And now when I go to adjust the tracking, the letters space out from the center. Of course I don't want some plain old font, I want something big and bold. I'm going to pick Humans BT, which I assume the T stands for thick. The font will be included in the tutorial package, which you'll be able to find on my Patreon page for free. You can find those links in the description below. Increase the tracking a little more. And next we're going to make the font bigger, and sure I could fiddle with font sizes, but an easy way to do that is to transform it. Hit Ctrl T on the keyboard, then if I hold Shift and Alt, I can transform the size uniformly and outwards from the center rather than a corner. Once you're satisfied, press Enter. Next up, I want to turn this text into a vector, but first we need to take a look at what a raster image is and how it compares to a vector. You can think of a raster image as most of what you see on the internet. That picture of a cat is made up of only so many pixels, and if you try to make it zoom in, the program you're viewing it with has to start adding information to fill in the new space. And eventually it starts to lose fidelity. A vector, on the other hand, doesn't have that problem until it's saved out as a normal raster image. Vector images are made up of several points which can be rearranged at will, and then what's in between them is automatically filled in almost like a polygon in 3D space. This means you can resize it as needed without ever losing quality. This is great for things like cartoons or text, where there isn't a ton of detail. It's when detail needs to be added where vector starts to falter. But anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yes, right-click the layer, then select Convert to Shape, which will turn it into a vector. And next we need to change the color to something more interesting. I'll double-click on the box here, next to the layer name, which will bring up the color picker. I'm aiming for something of a metallic blue for the end piece, but feel free to experiment. Text isn't quite big enough, so I'll use the transform again to increase the scale a little bit more. Next I want to take my direct select tool with A. If you have the path selection, instead you can click and hold on the toolbar to change tools. We're going to extend the lower half of the C, so click and drag to select the points you want, then hold Shift as you drag to move them in a straight line. Hopefully you can see what I did there. I'm going to select the entire letter and then hit Ctrl T again to bring up my transform, and rotate it just a little just to make it appear as though it's fallen over. Then I'll do the same to the K, but rotate it in the opposite direction. I want these two letters on their own layer, and a quick and easy way to do that is to select them, then hit Ctrl J. This will work for any selection, but in this case it's going to copy what we have selected as is onto a new layer. Click on the eye to hide the new layer, switch back to the first layer, select the letters again, and then hit delete on your keyboard to get rid of the originals and turn the new layer back on. We'll scoot the layer over with the Move tool and select both of them and recenter them. A good way to keep track of your layers, especially when you have a lot of them, is to rename them. Double click on the layer, then simply type in what you want. Now comes the real magic, and by magic I mean duplicating and moving layers. I'm going to hit Ctrl J to copy the layer again, slide it underneath the DU layer, then proceed to make it black. Then with my Move tool, I'm going to tap the down arrow once and the right arrow once, then repeat those steps again, and again, and again, until you're satisfied. While you're moving it, you may want to occasionally skip moving it in one direction to help smooth out the transition. Once you're satisfied, you can select all your new layers and then press Ctrl E to merge them together. From there, you can duplicate it and move it, or move on to the next step. We'll basically be repeating the process again on the other side, but in the opposite direction. This will make it appear as though the camera is pointed towards the center of the lettering. Now that those are all set, I want to do some effects, but trying to paint them on manually or using shapes would be rather tedious. So instead we're going to right-click the layer and slide up to blending options. It'll bring up this newfangled window here with quite a lot of options. Feel free to explore the window, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stick to what's necessary for this example. You'll also see that the vector path is still around the text, and that can be kind of annoying to work around. So we're going to go up and disable that by going to View, Show, and unselect Target Path. Next I'm going to drop down and select Gradient Overlay from our Layer Style menu, and you'll see that the text now has, well, a gradient. We're going to go into Blend Mode, and now there's a bunch of different options. And here in the third section we have things like Overlay. These options tend to affect saturation and brightness. A brighter color blending in will produce a lighter result, and a darker color will be darker, whereas things like Screen will always brighten and Multiply will always darken. We'll select Soft Light and lower the opacity to about half to keep it as a matte metal look. Next up is Stroke, and we'll give you great tips about lowering your golf score. Or add a line around the edges of a layer. First drop down here is the position as to where on the edge it sits, and for this we want inside. Decrease the size to about 2 pixels, then we'll go ahead and drop down to color and choose a light blue. Finally, we want to go into Inner Shadow, and upon selecting it, the stroke that we added before now looks like a metal rim rather than just a change in color. Go ahead and turn global lighting off, as I don't want to use this direction for the rest of the project. And we just want to shift the light source a small amount. Last but not least, we'll bump the opacity up to about 95%. I want to apply this to the CK layer as well, but I don't want to have to redo all that, so a simple solution is to hover over the FX on the layer, then press Alt and drag it onto the desired layer, and voila! All we need to do is quickly fix the inner shadow to be coming from the opposite direction. Go back into blending options, back to inner shadow, and angle the light source towards the opposite side. With all that taken care of, we can now work on the 3D section of the lettering. Similarly to what we did before, right-click on the layer, go into blending options, and gradient overlay. But this time we're going to do something a little bit different. You want to click on the gradient bar here, which will bring up a second window. And you can see that gives you a few presets, but what we want to focus on is the gradient bar itself. Nodes on the top dictate opacity, and the ones on the bottom are color. If you click along the bottom, you'll add a node, and we want to add 4 more, so there's 6. Metal tends to have an alternating dark against light, especially if it's sitting next to other objects, so that's what I want to do when setting colors. Double click on a node, and you'll bring up the color picker, and from there we want to choose a dark steely blue. Then down the line continually get brighter as you alternate between dark and light. If you like what you came up with, then you can save it out as a preset for future use by typing into the box here, then hitting New. Once you're happy with what you have, go ahead and hit OK. This next step isn't entirely necessary, but a good thing to know if you don't want to use the magic wand tool or want to worry about painting outside of an area. I'm changing the blending mode, but because what's underneath is black, it's going to show up as black. And where it says lock, we want to click on this first box here that looks like a blank background. And what that basically does is it locks the layer to what already exists. Then for blending, I want to choose a mid-gray color and hit Alt Backspace to use my foreground color. And as you can see, it only filled in the lettering, which will now allow me to go back and change my blending. We're going to repeat what we did for the main lettering to create the background with the middle. First click Stroke, but instead of a lighter color, we want dark this time. And Inner Shadow, and once again, we'll have to adjust the direction of the light source. Make sure global lighting is turned off, but the shadow is falling just a bit too far. First I'm going to turn down the opacity and then drop down to distance. And what distance basically says is how far the shadow goes before it starts to fade off. It wouldn't be much of a duck without the CK, so once again we're going to copy the layer style over with Alt. Since the lettering is still black, we need to lock the layer, then use our fill color again with Alt Backspace. A quick adjustment of the inner shadow, and we're just about done with our lettering. The last thing I want to do is add a harsher light source to really help sell that metallic look. We'll click on our DU layer, then add a new layer with the button below. And now I'm going to make a layer clip. Hold Alt and click between the layers. You should see the cursor change like so. Clipping works similarly to how layer lock works, as what's on a clipped layer will only appear inside the layer that's underneath of it. However, you won't be able to clip layer inside of a clip. Instead, you can clip as many layers as you want inside of one single layer. Bring up the marquee tool, and we want square 1 for this, so if it's not active, click and hold on the toolbar to let you select it. Drag a box about midway through the lettering, but if I use fill as it is now, it's going to create a rather harsh edge. Go up to Select, Modify Selection, then Feather. We want to have it be at about 30 pixels. Then hit OK. Alternatively, you can also set it to feather initially in the tool action bar. I want to fill this with a sky blue color, going into my color picker here and finding something that I think will work. Hit Alt Backspace to fill once again, and then to deselect you just hit Ctrl D. Leaving it as it is a bit too harsh, so we'll go over to opacity and lower it to around 60%. Hit Ctrl J to duplicate the layer, which will pop it out of his clipping, but that's okay because we want to move it over on top of our other 2 letters with the Move tool. Move the layer to the top of the stack, and once again by holding Alt between them, we can clip it in. I'll bring up the transform and just rotate it a tiny bit to match the lettering. Almost done. Just a couple more items to go. Next, we'll be adding a shadow to the bottom of the lettering. We'll go back to the marquee tool and swap it out with the circle marquee this time around. I'm going to select the mid-saturation dark blue color, as the shadow will be picking up some of the coloration from the lettering. Clicking towards the center here, if I hold Alt, it'll grow out from the initial point like so. It's not quite what I want, and instead of redoing it, I can just go up to Select, then Transform Selection, and this will basically give you the normal transform tools, but let you adjust the marquee itself. Drag these edges in a little bit, then bump it up again. Again, I want to feather this, so we'll go to Select, Modify, and Feather. The 30 pixels we used before will work just fine. I'm just going to make a few more adjustments by lowering the opacity and then transforming it to bump it up further underneath the lettering and shrinking it just a bit. Last but not least, we're going to make it look like the C and K are sticking into the ground. I could take the eraser and simply carve out a piece of each, but if I want or need to go back and change it later on, then that information is lost. So a way to get around that is to use layer masks, which have a variety of useful applications. But first, because we used a layer style, placing a mask over it won't remove it. To fix that, we'll go into the layer style once more, and we need to highlight the box Layer Mask Hides Effects. Over here in the layer panel, we want the icon that looks like a box with a circle in the middle. Clicking on this will now add a layer mask to the CK layer. Unlike normally, when working with layer masks, the only colors available to you will be black, white, and gray. White will make the image show, black will hide it, and gray works much like adjusting the opacity. For this last part, I'm going to be using a default hard round brush that comes with Photoshop, but the same effect can be accomplished using the lasso tool when filling in the selection with black. Since both my colors are set to white, I need to hit D on the keyboard to reset them, and then press X for them to swap places. I'll also need to add a layer mask to the layer sitting below the lettering, and also set the layer mask to hide effects in the blending options. Then very carefully, I'm going to come in along here and just hide some of the back of the sea, just enough that it appears to be sinking into the ground. Then I'll repeat the process on the K, but I've run into a small snag here, where I can't hide both at once, but luckily I can just copy the layer mask onto it by holding Alt and dragging. That'll do it for this tutorial. You'll be able to find the PSD file for this project on my Patreon page for free, along with any other tutorial resources in the future. And as always, thanks for watching.